This bomber left England, and nobody knows where it went. It took off. It had a crew. It had fuel. It had orders. And then, nothing. No radio call. No wreckage. No bodies. Just silence. The kind of silence that governments prefer. The kind of silence that lasts decades. Somewhere over Europe, a bomber full crew aboard simply ceased to exist. And the most disturbing part, the people who were supposed to find it stopped looking. Welcome to Warplane Mysteries, the channel where the aircraft that disappeared finally get a voice. Now, before we go any further, if you are new here, think of subscribing to this channel. The same way you'd think about renewing your pension plan. You don't want to miss a single payment. And trust us, you do not want to miss a single episode. Hit that subscribe button. It takes 1 second, and it costs you nothing. Also, we love our community here. Drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Whether you're in London, Lahore, Lagos, or somewhere quiet in between, let us know. We read every single one. Now, let's go back to that runway in England. The morning was cold and gray, the kind of morning that England knows well. Ground crews moved quietly across the airfield. Mechanics checked engines. Officers reviewed flight logs. Everything followed procedure. Everything looked exactly as it should. The bomber sat on the runway, fueled and ready. Its crew, trained men, experienced men, climbed aboard and took their positions. They had flown missions before. They knew the risks. They accepted them. That was the nature of the work assigned to them during one of history's most brutal and unforgiving conflicts. Clearance was given. The engines roared, and the aircraft lifted off English soil and disappeared into the clouds above. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw it. No distress call came through the radio channels. No emergency signal was ever recorded. No Allied patrol reported wreckage. No enemy record reviewed decades later after archives were opened logged the destruction of that aircraft. It simply went somewhere. And whatever that somewhere was, it swallowed the plane completely. In the immediate aftermath, the military did what militaries always do in wartime. They logged the loss. They noted the crew as missing. They moved on. There were other missions, other aircraft, other crews. The machinery of war does not pause to grieve individual disappearances. It records them, files them, and continues forward. But here is where the story begins to reveal something far more important than a simple wartime tragedy. Because when researchers decades later began requesting the official records of this mission, they found something deeply unusual. The documents were incomplete, not damaged by time, not lost to fire or flood. Incomplete. Pages referenced in official indexes were simply absent. Communication logs from that specific date showed gaps that could not be explained by routine archiving procedures. And the officers who had been on duty that morning, the men who gave the clearance, who watched the aircraft take off, had left no personal testimony, no memoirs, no interviews, nothing, for an event that should have generated a standard paper trail. The trail had been carefully thinned. And this is the detail that transforms a wartime disappearance into something every serious observer in any field must study closely. Because when records disappear alongside aircraft, the question is no longer about navigation. The question becomes about intention. There is an old saying among archivists, "What is missing tells you more than what remains." And in the case of this bomber, what was missing was extraordinary. Most military disappearances from this era follow a predictable documentary pattern. A loss is recorded. An investigation is opened. Witnesses are interviewed. Conclusions, however unsatisfying, are eventually committed to paper. The bureaucratic machinery of wartime Britain was meticulous. It had to be. Accountability was not optional when Parliament, families, and the public were watching. But this case broke that pattern entirely. When historians and independent researchers began filing formal requests through declassified military archives in the decades following the war, they encountered something that could not be explained by simple administrative oversight. The file existed. It had a reference number. It had an official title. It occupied a registered slot in the archival index exactly where it should have been. But when the file itself was retrieved and opened, the interior told a different story. Critical pages, specifically the operational orders, the final communication transcripts, and the post-mission investigation summary were absent, not redacted with black ink, which would at least acknowledge their existence. Simply gone, as though they had never been placed there at all. In intelligence and institutional analysis, this distinction matters enormously. Redaction says, this information exists, but you cannot see it. Absence says, we are not even confirming this information ever existed. One is a wall, the other is an erasure. And erasure is a far more deliberate act. What made this pattern even more significant was that the missing documentation was not isolated to a single archive location. Researchers cross-referencing records held at separate institutions, facilities that operated independently and stored duplicate materials precisely to prevent total loss, found the same gaps appearing across multiple locations simultaneously, the same pages missing in the same places simultaneously. This does not happen by accident. This does not happen through the natural deterioration of paper and time. This happens when someone or several people operating with shared purpose makes a decision. And here is where the story demands the attention of every serious professional, every entrepreneur, every decision-maker sitting in a position of organizational responsibility today. Because the mechanics of institutional erasure did not die with the Second World War, they were perfected by it. What was rehearsed on classified military files in the 1940s became the template for boardrooms, regulatory bodies, and corporate archives in every decade that followed. The bomber was never just a bomber. It was a rehearsal, a test of how completely an institution could make something officially disappear. And the answer was disturbingly complete. A plane does not vanish because one person decided it should. A plane vanishes because an entire system was built to allow it. This is the detail that most observers miss entirely. They search for the single guilty party. The one officer who gave the wrong order. The one clerk who removed the documents. They look for a villain because a villain is simple, and simple explanations are comfortable. But the truth of what happened to this bomber was never about one individual. It was about architecture. The military operational structure of wartime Britain, like most large institutions under extreme pressure, had developed something that organizational analysts today would immediately recognize. It had built, entirely without intending to, a system in which accountability had gaps built directly into its design. Consider how the chain of command actually functioned in practice. Operational orders were issued from one office, communicated through a second, executed by a third, and reviewed, if reviewed at all, by a fourth. Each layer believed its responsibility ended at the point of handoff. Each layer assumed the layer above or below carried the burden of final accountability. Nobody owned the complete picture. And when nobody owns the complete picture can quietly cease to exist. There was also the matter of wartime normalization, a psychological and institutional phenomenon that deserves far more serious study than it typically receives. During periods of prolonged crisis, organizations begin to treat abnormal losses as normal operating costs. Aircraft go missing. Men do not return. Resources disappear into the fog of conflict. And gradually, what would have triggered urgent investigation in peacetime becomes simply another line in a weekly summary report. Loss becomes routine, and when loss becomes routine, it becomes invisible. This is precisely the condition under which the bomber's disappearance was processed, not with alarm, Not with the intensity that missing men and missing aircraft should have demanded, but with the quiet, efficient, almost indifferent motion of a bureaucratic machine that had learned to absorb tragedy without pausing to examine it. The forms were completed. The boxes were checked. The file was closed. And somewhere within that process, at a junction point that researchers have never been able to precisely identify, someone recognized that the system's indifference could be used, that the gaps built into the architecture for reasons of wartime efficiency could serve a very different purpose entirely. This is not a historical curiosity. Every large organization operating today, every corporation, every institution, every enterprise that has grown beyond the point where one person can see everything, has inherited this exact architecture, the same handoff gaps, the same normalization of loss, the same assumption that someone else is watching the complete picture. The bomber did not fall through the cracks. The cracks were wide enough to fit it. History does not repeat itself exactly, but its mechanisms repeat with remarkable precision. And the mechanism demonstrated by this vanished bomber, the deliberate architecture of unaccountability, the normalized erasure of inconvenient records, the system designed to absorb loss without examination, appeared in every major institutional failure of the modern era, not by coincidence, by inheritance. The organizations that shape the post-war world, its corporations, its regulatory bodies, its financial institutions, were built and led by men who had learned their organizational habits inside exactly these kinds of wartime structures. They carried those habits forward. They embedded them into peacetime systems. And those systems were then inherited by the generation that followed, and the generation after that. This is why the bomber matters today, not as a military curiosity, not as an unsolved mystery for aviation enthusiasts, but as a case study in how institutions protect themselves from accountability and what that not protection ultimately costs everyone operating within or alongside those institutions. For the serious decision-maker, the strategic lesson is precise and actionable. The first principle is this: in any organization, the most dangerous information is not what is reported incorrectly, it is what is never reported at all. The bomber's disappearance was not falsified. It was simply thinned, reduced to the minimum that procedure required. And that minimum was carefully calibrated to answer questions without actually revealing anything. Every entrepreneur building a team, every executive managing a division, every investor evaluating a partnership must ask one specific question that most people never think to ask. Not, what does this report say? But, what should this report contain that it doesn't? The second principle is equally critical. Systems do not fail accidentally at the moments that matter most. They fail by design. The gaps in the bomber's chain of command were not engineering errors. They were features of a structure optimized for speed and volume at the direct expense of visibility and accountability. Modern enterprises repeat this mistake constantly. They scale rapidly. They add layers. They distribute responsibilities so broadly that, eventually, no single person can see the entire picture. And in that blindness, things disappear. Funds, records, decisions. People just as quietly and completely as a bomber over wartime Europe. The aircraft left England carrying men who trusted the system that sent them. The system did not deserve that trust. And the most important question every serious professional must carry forward from this story is not what happened to that bomber. It is this: in the organization you are building, leading, or trusting today, would you even know if something had vanished?